This issue of Japanese history continues from the previous issue, looking at the Meiji Restoration and its aftermath. Starting from this issue, we will explain the Civil War, the last and greatest civil war in modern Japan. The Seinan War was a rebellion started by Takamori Saigo, a prominent figure in the Meiji Restoration. This rebellion was much larger than any other rebellion that had ever been started by a samurai. The samurai of Satsuma decided to send out an army of soldiers to question the government based on the testimony of a police officer sent by the government who had confessed under severe torture that he had come to assassinate Saigo. On February 15, 1877, Saigo's army, with Kurino as its commander-in-chief, left Kagoshima for Tokyo. The leaders of Saigo's army considered what to do about the first barrier, Kumamoto Castle, a strategic point for the government forces. One plan was to monitor Kumamoto Castle with a small number of soldiers, while the main force would advance eastward. The other plan was to attack Kumamoto Castle in full force and then advance eastward. Shinohara, who was the vice-general rank, insisted that Kumamoto Castle would fall immediately after a general attack, so the decision was made to attack Kumamoto Castle in a general assault. In terms of strategic value, there was no point in dropping Kumamoto Castle. Moreover, the longer it took to capture the castle, the more time the government forces would have, which was favorable to them. Both Kurino and Shinohara were convinced. They believed that if the Satsuma samurai went into battle, the peasant soldiers would soon be too frightened to fight. They were optimistic that Kumamoto Castle could be captured quickly. Meanwhile, the government forces at Kumamoto Castle held a strategy meeting on the 15th when Saigo's army departed, and decided to hold a siege at Kumamoto Castle. Joining them at Kumamoto Castle were Gentaro Kodama, Chief of Staff, Yasuyuki Oku, Commander of the 2nd Army, and Kigenori Nogi, Commander of the 4th Army, who would later play an active role in the Russo-Japanese War. Considering the speed at which this information was transmitted, it is thought that Toshimiki Okubo had anticipated the Satsuma rebellion and had enhanced his information network early on. On February 19, a fire of unknown cause broke out in Kumamoto Castle. The fire destroyed all the food and other supplies that had been stockpiled. It may have been the work of spies from Saigo's army, but no official records remain. On February 20th, Saigo's army arrived at Kumamoto Castle. Then, on February 22nd, Saigo's army made a general attack on Kumamoto Castle. Saigo's army numbered 14,000 men, while the besieged government forces numbered 4,000. Saigo's army launched an onslaught, but met with surprising resistance from the government forces, and the attack ended without taking down a single fortress on the first day of the attack. The failure of this attack caused the leaders of Saigo's army to disagree. Shinohara insisted on attacking Kumamoto Castle with the entire army, but other officers argued for the idea of partially surrounding Kumamoto Castle and the main force moving northward. Finally, Saigo adopted the opinion of the majority and decided that the main force would move northward. Major Marizuke Nogi, who was in Kokura, was on his way to reinforce Kumamoto Castle, but Saigo's army had arrived there earlier. Nogi led a force of about 700 men. Hearing the news that Nogi's army was moving south, Saigo's army defeated Nogi. Nogi had several times fewer soldiers than Saigo's army, and in some respects it was inevitable that he would lose. In the early stages of the war, not a few commoner soldiers were frightened of the Satsuma samurai, and many of them ran away when they saw Saigo's army. Later, when it became clear that they could fight on equal terms with the Satsuma samurai, the number of soldiers who ran away decreased. The government forces also rushed to prepare for war. Lieutenant General Aritomo Yamagata, Commander-in-Chief, had Miyoshi and Notsu lead a force of 5,000 men to prevent Saigo's army from advancing northward. This Shizuo Nozu was the brother of Mishitsura Nozu, commander of the 4th Army in the Russo-Japanese War. On February 25, the first major battle took place between the government and Saigo forces. This was the Battle of Takase. This was the first and last battle in which the two top commanders, Shinohara and Kurino, fought together. The Saigo forces, which were outnumbered in both supplies and troops, had the upper hand in the battle. But Shinohara, who was in charge of the central forces, retreated without permission, and as a result, the Saigo forces gave up the capture of Takase and retreated. After this battle, Saigo's army was on the defensive. The general-in-chief, Yamagata, arrived in Hakata on the 25th to prepare the soldiers to reinforce the fort. While this Yamagata waited for his soldiers to arrive, the Satsuma forces had time to reinforce the fort and redeploy their troops. Thus, the government forces were to attack Tabaruzaka, where Saigo's army had established a position. Tabaruzaka was the only road that could carry artillery from Hakata to Kumamoto, and the government forces had no choice but to take this road to get to Kumamoto. There, Saigo's army deployed 7,000 men and waited for the government forces. The Battle of Tabaruzaka lasted 1 month and became the most fierce battle of the Seinan War. In this battle, the second-in-command of Saigo's army, Kumamoto Shinohara, was shot and killed while commanding the front line. The government forces, superior in military strength, devoted many men to the capture of Tabaruzaka, but were unable to overtake the position defended by Saigo's army. The reason for this was that the commoner soldiers were completely unable to defeat the hand-to-hand combat using terrain-based gunfire and the swords of the Satsuma samurai. The government army introduced a new organization to counter the white armies of Saigo's army, the police force. Many samurai were employed in this police force. The majority of them were Satsuma samurai, but many Aizu clan samurai, who were the enemy in the Boshin War, were employed by the police, and many of them volunteered to fight in this battle against Saigo's army. It is an irony of history that the samurai from Satsuma, the driving force behind the Meiji Restoration, rebelled against the government, while the samurai from Aizu, who lost in the Meiji Restoration, fought as soldiers in the government army. Yamagata, the general who established the conscription system, was reluctant to allow the samurai to join the army, but eventually permitted them and named them the Batoutai. On March 14, with the Batoutai as the main force, the government forces launched an attack. The Batoutai were not afraid of the hand-to-hand combat of the Satsuma samurai and fought equally well with them. Thanks to this, the government forces succeeded in capturing the corner of the Tabaruzaka fortress. Then, on March 20th, the government forces attacked Saigo's army with their maximum force. The government forces, which had superior artillery power, launched an unprecedented bombardment and then dared to charge. While the government forces were able to reinforce their numbers one after another, Saigo's army was slowly losing numbers. Unable to cope with this massive attack, Saigo's army finally abandoned Tabaruzaka and retreated. During the war, Saigo was almost completely withdrawn, leaving the war to Kurino and Shinohara. Saigo, who had been a brilliant general staff during the Boshin War, was nowhere to be seen. We still do not know what his true intentions were. After retreating from Tabaruzaka, Saigo's army only retreated slowly. I will explain the end of the Seinan War in my next video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button.